Bullies tore her jacket on the bus. Her fist did the talking. The early morning sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy, fingerprint-smudged windows of Jefferson High School as Kira Valdez made her way through the overcrowded main hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting an unforgiving, harsh glare across the sea of students rushing to their first period classes. The air was thick with the mingled scents of cheap cologne, morning coffee from the teacher's lounge, and the lingering odor of disinfectant that the custodial staff used to combat the daily chaos of teenage life. Kira's small hands gripped the frayed straps of her worn canvas backpack so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The bag itself told a story of financial struggle. Once navy blue, it had faded to a dull, grayish color, with patches where the fabric had worn thin and small tears that had been carefully mended with safety pins and determination. Inside, her textbooks were a mixture of previous editions borrowed from the library and photocopied pages when even used books were beyond her family's budget. At barely 5 feet tall, Kira seemed almost childlike among her taller, more confident peers. Her unruly mass of dark brown curls had a mind of their own, constantly escaping from whatever hair tie or clip she attempted to use to contain them. The humid climate of their new city only made the situation worse, causing her hair to expand and frizz in ways that no amount of drugstore hair product could control. Her thick-rimmed glasses, a necessity rather than a fashion choice, constantly slipped down her small nose, forcing her to push them up every few minutes in a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. Kira had transferred to Jefferson High School exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days ago, not that she was counting. The move had been sudden and necessary when her mother, Carmen Valdez, had finally landed a stable job as a night shift supervisor at a packaging plant on the other side of town. After months of unemployment following the closure of the small restaurant where she had worked as a waitress, Carmen had jumped at the opportunity, even though it meant uprooting their small family from the familiar, if run-down, neighborhood they had called home for the past 5 years. The transition had been brutal for Kira. In Phoenix, she had been just another face in the crowd at a large, underfunded public school where survival was the primary concern and academic achievement was a luxury few could afford. But Jefferson High was different. It was in a more affluent district where most students drove their own cars to school, carried the latest smartphones, and wore clothes that cost more than Kira's family spent on groceries in a month. Her thrift store wardrobe marked her as an outsider from the moment she walked through the doors. While other girls her age wore designer jeans and name-brand sneakers, Kira made do with whatever she could find at the local Goodwill store. Her jeans were often a size too big, cinched at the waist with a belt that had seen better days, and her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, chosen for durability rather than style. She had learned to safety pin small tears and use fabric markers to color over stains, becoming an expert at making old clothes look as presentable as possible. Her thick-rimmed glasses had been a necessity since the age of 10, when her teacher noticed she was squinting at the blackboard and struggling to see assignments clearly. The frames were the cheapest option available at the community health clinic, practical black plastic that served their purpose but did nothing to enhance her appearance. Kira had watched enviously as other students wore contact lenses or stylish frames that seemed to add to their confidence rather than marking them as different. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she navigated through clusters of students who had formed their social hierarchies over years of shared experiences. Their voices created a constant din that echoed off the metal lockers lining both sides of the corridor, a cacophony of weekend plans, gossip about relationships, complaints about homework, and discussions about the latest social media drama that seemed to consume so much of their attention. Kira had quickly learned that invisibility was her best defense mechanism in this environment. She kept her head down, her eyes focused on the scuffed linoleum floor, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She had developed a mental map of the school that allowed her to take the least crowded routes between classes, timing her movements to avoid the rush of students who seemed to own every hallway and common area. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent years training her body to be strong and capable, yet here she was, trying to shrink into herself and disappear. Back in Phoenix, her uncle Roberto had taught her that a true martial artist carried themselves with confidence and awareness, shoulders back and head held high. But survival at Jefferson High required a different kind of strategy, one that involved making herself invisible to avoid becoming a target. Her locker was located in what she had come to think of as enemy territory, a section of hallway that was frequented by the school's most popular and intimidating students. Every morning, she approached it with the same sense of dread that a soldier might feel entering a battlefield. The combination lock was temperamental, requiring just the right touch and patience that she often didn't have when she felt the weight of curious and sometimes hostile stares. "Well, well, look who's gracing us with her presence," came a voice that made Kira's stomach drop and her heart rate instantly accelerate. She didn't need to look up to know who was speaking. That particular tone of mock friendliness masking genuine cruelty had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Tyler Morrison stepped directly into her path, his imposing 6-foot frame blocking not only her route to her locker, but also the harsh fluorescent light from the ceiling fixture above. As captain of Jefferson High's wrestling team, Tyler had built a reputation based on a combination of athletic achievement and systematic intimidation. His bleached blonde hair was always perfectly styled, with an expensive gel that kept every strand in place, and his cocky smirk had become his trademark, an expression that seemed permanently etched on his features, as if he had been born knowing he was better than everyone around him. Tyler's physical presence was undeniably intimidating. Years of wrestling had sculpted his body into a powerful machine, with broad shoulders that strained against his designer polo shirts and arms that looked capable of crushing anything that got in his way. His hands were large and calloused from countless hours in the gym, and he had a habit of cracking his knuckles when he was preparing to intimidate someone, a sound that had become associated with impending trouble for his victims. Behind him, like loyal subjects flanking their king, stood his carefully curated group of followers. Jake Sullivan was a study in contrasts to Tyler's imposing presence. Tall and lanky, with bright red hair that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, and a face full of freckles that might have made him look innocent if not for the cruel gleam in his pale blue eyes. Jake's role in their group dynamic was clear. He was the laugh track, the one who validated Tyler's every comment and action with enthusiastic approval. His laugh was particularly grating, a high-pitched cackle that seemed to pierce through any ambient noise and draw attention to whatever performance Tyler was putting on. Jake wore his hair in a deliberately messy style that probably took him longer to achieve than most people spent on their entire morning routine. His clothes were expensive, but chosen to look casual. Distressed jeans that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and vintage band t-shirts that he had never heard the music of. Everything about his appearance was calculated to project an image of effortless cool, though the effort was obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. Completing their trio was Brittany Pierce, whose presence added a different but equally intimidating dimension to their group. Brittany was the undisputed queen bee of Jefferson High's social hierarchy, a position she had held since middle school and defended with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned politician. Her platinum blonde hair was always perfectly straightened, falling in a sheet of silk that caught the light as she moved her head. She spent considerable time and money maintaining this look, visiting a high-end salon every few weeks to touch up her roots and ensure that every strand fell exactly where it was supposed to. Brittany's makeup was always flawless. applied with the precision of a professional artist. Her foundation was perfectly matched to her skin tone, her eyeliner sharp enough to cut glass, and her lipstick chosen to complement whatever outfit she had selected for the day. She changed her nail polish color to match her clothes, a small detail that most people wouldn't notice, but that demonstrated the level of attention she paid to her appearance. Her wardrobe was a carefully curated collection of designer pieces that she rotated strategically to ensure she never wore the same combination twice in a month. Every outfit was photographed and documented on her social media accounts, which had gained a substantial following among students, not just at Jefferson, but at other schools in the district. She had turned her appearance into a brand, complete with sponsored posts for local boutiques and beauty products, but it was Brittany's smile that was truly her most dangerous weapon. A perfectly practiced expression that could appear warm and friendly to teachers and authority figures while simultaneously conveying pure malice to her intended targets. She had perfected this dual expression over years of practice, learning how to project innocence while orchestrating some of the most sophisticated social terrorism that Jefferson High had ever seen. "Excuse me," Kira mumbled, her voice barely audible above the noise of the crowded hallway. She tried to step around Tyler's imposing figure, hoping to reach her locker and escape this encounter with minimal damage to her already fragile sense of security. "Excuse me," Tyler repeated in an exaggerated, high-pitched voice that was clearly meant to mock her. The imitation was cruel and deliberate, designed to make her feel small and ridiculous. His performance drew the immediate and expected response from Jake, whose characteristic cackle rang out across the hallway like a dinner bell for social predators. "What's the rush, scholarship girl?" Tyler continued, using the nickname he had assigned to her within her first week at Jefferson. The term was meant to remind her and everyone within earshot that she didn't belong here, that she was only able to attend this school because of financial aid and charity. "Late for your remedial classes?" The comment about remedial classes was particularly cutting because it was entirely inaccurate. Kira was actually enrolled in several advanced placement courses and maintained a grade point average that put her in the top 10% of her class. But Tyler's comments weren't about accuracy. They were about power and humiliation, about establishing and maintaining the social order that kept him at the top and students like Kira at the bottom. Kira felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as other students began to slow their pace and turn their attention to the unfolding drama. She could feel their stares like physical weights, each curious look adding to her growing sense of mortification. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid, becoming the center of attention in a way that exposed her vulnerability and marked her as a target for future harassment. The attention of the crowd seemed to energize Tyler, who clearly thrived on having an audience for his performances. He straightened his shoulders and took a step closer to Kira, reducing the space between them in a way that was calculated to make her feel trapped and powerless. This was all part of his well-practiced routine, a psychological warfare technique that he had perfected over years of tormenting students who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Tyler's comment about scholarships hit particularly close to home because it touched on one of Kira's deepest sources of shame and anxiety. Her mother worked double shifts at the packaging plant, often coming home with her hands stained from the industrial dyes and her back aching from hours of repetitive labor. Carmen left for work before Kira woke up and often didn't return until after she had gone to bed, their communication reduced to hastily scrawled notes left on the kitchen counter and brief conversations on Carmen's lunch breaks. Kira knew that every penny her mother earned was carefully budgeted and accounted for. Their small apartment was in a complex that had seen better days, with thin walls that allowed them to hear every argument and television show from their neighbors. The carpet was worn and stained from previous tenants, and the appliances were old and temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and creative problem-solving to keep them functional. Despite working such long hours, Carmen often struggled to make ends meet. Kira had learned not to ask for things that other students took for granted: new clothes for the school year, money for school trips or activities, or even small luxuries like pizza on weekends. She had become expert at finding free or low-cost alternatives, spending hours at the public library, using their computers and internet access, shopping for school supplies at dollar stores, and making her lunch every day from whatever was available in their sparsely stocked refrigerator. "I'm just trying to get to my locker," Kira said quietly, adjusting her glasses in the nervous gesture that had become automatic whenever she felt threatened or uncomfortable. Her voice was steady despite the emotions churning inside her, a testament to years of practice at hiding her true feelings from those who might use them against her. "Oh, she speaks," Brittany chimed in with fake enthusiasm that was so exaggerated it bordered on theatrical. Her voice carried that particular tone that popular girls seemed to perfect. Bright and animated on the surface, but with an undercurrent of venom that made her true intentions clear. "I was starting to think you were mute or something, though honestly, it might be better if you stayed that way." Brittany's comment drew laughter from the small crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle. The sound of their amusement felt like needles against Kira's skin, each laugh a reminder of how isolated and vulnerable she was in this environment. She could see some students holding up their phones, no doubt recording the interaction for later posting on social media, where it would be dissected and commented on by an even larger audience. The recording of these interactions had become a standard practice among the students at Jefferson High. Moments of humiliation and confrontation were captured and shared with the enthusiasm that previous generations might have reserved for sharing family photos. The videos would be posted with captions designed to maximize entertainment value, often with emojis and hashtags that turned real human suffering into content for consumption. Kira tried again to move past them, but Tyler deliberately stepped sideways, effectively blocking her path with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this maneuver countless times before. This blocking technique was part of his repertoire of intimidation tactics, never quite crossing the line into physical assault that might get him in trouble with school authorities, but creating a clear demonstration of power and control that left his victims feeling helpless and trapped. This dance of intimidation had become a daily routine over the past several weeks, and Kira had come to dread each encounter with a growing sense of inevitability. She knew that Tyler would find her, that he would create some new humiliation for the entertainment of his followers and the broader student body, and that she would have to endure it with as much dignity as she could muster while feeling a piece of her self-respect chip away with each interaction. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly guess from looking at her slight frame and nervous demeanor, was that Kira had spent the last 8 years of her life training in mixed martial arts at her uncle's gym back in Phoenix. Roberto Valdez had been a professional fighter before an injury ended his career and led him to open his own training facility in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Uncle Roberto's gym had been Kira's second home from the age of 8, when her mother had needed somewhere safe for her daughter to spend time after school while she worked late shifts at the restaurant. What had started as a childcare solution had evolved into something much more significant when Roberto recognized Kira's natural athleticism and fierce determination. Roberto had been careful and methodical in his approach to training his young niece. He had started with basic self-defense techniques, teaching her how to break free from grabs and how to create distance between herself and a potential attacker. But as Kira grew older and more skilled, the training had evolved to include advanced grappling techniques, striking combinations, and the kind of ground fighting that could neutralize opponents much larger than herself. The training had been intense and demanding. Roberto had taught her that martial arts wasn't just about physical techniques, it was about mental discipline, emotional control, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to walk away. He had drilled into her the importance of using violence only as a last resort when all other options had been exhausted and she or someone else was in genuine danger. Under Roberto's guidance, Kira had developed muscles that were hidden beneath her oversized sweaters and baggy clothes. Her slight frame was deceiving. What appeared to be the body of a fragile teenage girl was actually a finely tuned instrument capable of generating tremendous power and speed. Her hands, which looked delicate and soft, were actually conditioned from years of striking practice. Her legs, hidden beneath loose-fitting jeans, were strong enough to sweep opponents off their feet or deliver kicks that could incapacitate someone twice her size. But perhaps more importantly than the physical skills, Roberto had taught Kira about patience and timing. He had shown her how to read opponents, how to identify their weaknesses and exploit them with precision rather than brute force. He had taught her that the greatest victory was often achieved without throwing a single punch, through psychological warfare and strategic positioning that left opponents defeated before the physical confrontation even began. Most crucially, Roberto had instilled in Kira a deep understanding of responsibility that came with her abilities. He had made it clear that her skills were to be used for protection, not aggression, to defend herself and others who couldn't defend themselves, never to bully or intimidate those who were weaker. This moral foundation had become as much a part of her training as the physical techniques, a code of conduct that guided her decisions both inside and outside the gym. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on Kira. She possessed the skills and knowledge to end this confrontation with Tyler in a matter of seconds, but her mother's voice echoed constantly in her mind with the reminder that violence never solves anything, Mija. You're better than that. Carmen had worked hard to create a stable, peaceful life for her daughter, and she feared that any kind of fighting would lead Kira down a dangerous path that could destroy the future she was working so hard to build. So Kira endured. She absorbed the daily humiliations and psychological torture with the same discipline that she had once applied to her martial arts training. She ducked her head and finally managed to slip past Tyler's imposing figure, her heart racing with adrenaline that her body wanted to use for fighting, but that she forced herself to channel into simply surviving another day. As she reached her locker and began working the temperamental combination lock, she could hear Brittany's voice carrying down the hallway with perfect clarity. "Did you see how red she got? It's like she's never talked to normal people before." The comment was designed to be overheard, another layer of humiliation added to an already painful interaction. The library had become Kira's sanctuary during lunch periods, a refuge from the social battlefield that was the cafeteria. While other students crowded into the large dining hall with its circular tables and bench seating, engaging in the complex social negotiations that determined who sat where and with whom, Kira found solace among the dusty books and quiet corners of the school's surprisingly well-stocked library. The library at Jefferson High was a remnant from an earlier era when the school had been better funded and the community had placed a higher value on academic achievement. The tall shelves were filled with both classic literature and contemporary fiction, reference books that were still relevant despite their age, and periodicals that provided windows into worlds beyond the confines of their small city. The reading area featured comfortable chairs and tables positioned near large windows that provided natural light during the day and a sense of openness that was lacking in most other areas of the school. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian who had overseen this domain for more than 20 years, had grown fond of Kira during her short time at Jefferson. Mrs. Henderson was a small, grey-haired woman who wore practical cardigans and comfortable shoes, and who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of which students needed the library as more than just a place to study. She had taken to saving interesting novels for Kira to discover, leaving them on the returns cart near her favorite table with small handwritten notes suggesting why she might enjoy them. The librarian had noticed Kira's preference for stories about strong female characters who overcame adversity through intelligence and determination rather than waiting to be rescued. She had introduced her to authors like Tamora Pierce, whose fantasy novels featured warrior heroines, and Laurie Halse Anderson, whose contemporary fiction dealt with real-world challenges that resonated with Kira's own experiences. Today, Kira sat at her usual table, near the back of the library, positioned so that she could see anyone approaching while maintaining enough distance from other students to avoid unwanted interactions. She was attempting to focus on her chemistry homework, working through a particularly challenging problem set that required careful attention to detail and precise calculations. The equations and formulas provided a welcome escape from the social complexities of high school life. In chemistry, there were clear rules and predictable outcomes, unlike the chaotic world of teenage social dynamics. She was deep in concentration, her pencil moving steadily across the graph paper as she balanced a complex equation, when she became aware of someone approaching her table. She looked up to see Marcus Chen standing nearby, holding his own stack of books and wearing the uncertain expression of someone who wasn't sure if they would be welcome. "Mind if I sit here?" Marcus asked, his voice soft and respectful. His question was genuine rather than rhetorical. He was actually asking for permission rather than simply assuming he could join her, a courtesy that was rare among teenagers. Marcus was a quiet student from her advanced placement English class, someone she had noticed but never really talked to, beyond the brief interactions required for group projects and class discussions. He had kind, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that were similar to her own, and he consistently wore band t-shirts that suggested he had excellent taste in music. Today's shirt featured the logo of an indie rock band that Kira recognized and respected, indicating that he was someone who sought out quality music rather than simply following whatever was popular on the radio. "Sure," Kira replied, surprised by the interaction, but pleased to have company that didn't come with an agenda of harassment or humiliation. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, moving her chemistry notebook slightly to make more room on the table. As Marcus settled into the chair across from her, arranging his books and pulling out a mechanical pencil with the careful precision of someone who took his academic work seriously, Kira noticed a small bruise on his forearm that was partially hidden by the sleeve of his t-shirt. The mark was dark purple at the center, fading to yellow around the edges in a way that suggested it was several days old and had been more severe when it was fresh. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, gesturing toward the bruise with a subtle nod that wouldn't draw attention from other students in the library. Marcus followed her gaze and quickly pulled down his sleeve to cover the mark, his movement automatic and practiced in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time he had tried to hide evidence of mistreatment. "Yeah, just clumsy," he said with a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes and that Kira immediately recognized as a lie. She had become expert at reading the subtle signs of abuse and intimidation, having spent months observing the aftermath of Tyler's campaigns against various students. There was a particular quality to the bruises that came from deliberate violence. They appeared in specific locations that were easy to conceal, and they were accompanied by a defensive body language that spoke of someone who had learned to minimize and hide their injuries. "They bother you too?" Kira asked, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to other tables, but with enough directness that Marcus would understand exactly who she meant by "they." Marcus hesitated for a long moment, his eyes darting around the library as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Tyler doesn't like that I'm in all the advanced classes. Says I'm making the rest of them look bad." He paused, studying her face with an expression that seemed to be evaluating whether he could trust her with this information. "I've seen what they do to you. I'm sorry I haven't... I should have said something." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of shared experience and mutual understanding. Marcus was acknowledging not only his own victimization, but also his failure to speak up when he witnessed Kira's harassment. It was a confession that revealed both his vulnerability and his conscience, and Kira could see the genuine regret in his expression. "It's okay," Kira replied, and she meant it. She understood the impossible position that witnesses to bullying found themselves in. Speaking up often meant becoming the next target, while staying silent meant living with the guilt of allowing others to suffer. "I understand why people don't want to get involved." The honesty of their exchange created an immediate bond between them, a shared understanding that transcended the usual awkwardness of teenage social interactions. They both knew what it felt like to be targeted, to walk through the hallways with a constant sense of dread, to have their daily lives dominated by the anticipation of the next humiliation or act of violence. They worked together in comfortable silence for the remainder of the lunch period, occasionally sharing a smile or a whispered comment about their assignments. Kira found herself stealing glances at Marcus as he worked, noting the way he concentrated intensely on his calculus homework, occasionally pushing his glasses up his nose in a gesture that mirrored her own nervous habit. There was something endearing about Marcus that went beyond his obvious intelligence and academic dedication. He had a gentle way of moving through the world that suggested he was someone who noticed details that others missed, who paid attention to the feelings and needs of people around him. When he finished his calculus assignment, he quietly offered to help Kira with a chemistry problem she was struggling with, explaining the concept in a way that was patient and clear without being condescending. For the first time since arriving at Jefferson High School, Kira felt like she might actually make a genuine friend. The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because she desperately craved meaningful human connection, and terrifying because friendship meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could be weaponized by people like Tyler and Brittany. The relative peace and growing sense of connection that Kira had been nurturing was shattered the next morning on the school bus, in an incident that would prove to be the breaking point that changed everything. The bus itself was a study in institutional neglect, once yellow, now faded to a sickly beige color, with cracked vinyl seats that had been repaired with duct tape and windows that didn't quite close properly, allowing cold air and exhaust fumes to seep into the passenger compartment. Kira had developed a strategy for bus survival, claiming a seat near the front where she hoped to avoid trouble and maintain some distance from Tyler and his crew, who always congregated in the back rows like feudal lords holding court in their territory. The front of the bus was also closer to Mr. Patterson, the driver, though she had learned not to expect any intervention from him when conflicts arose. Mr. Patterson was a tired-looking man in his 50s who had been driving school buses for more than a decade. He had learned to focus on the road and ignore whatever drama unfolded behind him, partly because he couldn't safely monitor the students while driving, and partly because he had discovered that getting involved in student conflicts often led to complaints from parents and administrators who preferred to pretend that such problems didn't exist. On this particular morning, Kira had settled into her usual seat and put in her earbuds, hoping to create a bubble of protection around herself with music that would drown out the increasingly loud and cruel comments that seemed to emanate from the back of the bus like toxic fumes. She pressed herself against the window and tried to focus on the passing scenery. Suburban houses with their neat lawns and late-model cars in the driveways, a visual reminder of the economic divide that separated her from most of her classmates. The music playing through her earbuds was carefully chosen for its calming effect, acoustic guitar melodies that her uncle Roberto had introduced her to, songs that reminded her of the peaceful moments they had shared after training sessions when he would talk to her about life, philosophy, and the importance of maintaining inner peace even in the face of external chaos. "Hey, Four Eyes!" Tyler's voice cut through her music like a knife, loud enough and sharp enough that she could hear it clearly despite the earbuds. She could feel the malicious energy radiating from the back of the bus, the excitement of a predator that had spotted its prey and was preparing to strike. Kira pulled out one earbud and turned slightly in her seat, hoping that acknowledging him quickly would satisfy whatever need for attention was driving this interaction. "What?" "I said, nice jacket," Tyler continued, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "Did you get it from the garbage bin behind Goodwill?" The comment felt like a physical blow to Kira's chest. The worn denim jacket she was wearing had belonged to her older sister, Rosa, and despite its frayed edges, faded color, and small patches where the fabric had worn thin, it was one of her most treasured possessions. Rosa had died in a car accident 2 years ago, and the jacket still carried the faint scent of her sister's perfume, a drugstore brand that Rosa had saved up to buy for special occasions. Rosa had been everything that Kira wished she could be: confident, outgoing, popular with her classmates, and seemingly immune to the kind of cruelty that Kira faced daily. She had been the kind of person who could walk into any room and make friends immediately, who never seemed to doubt her own worth or worry about what others thought of her. The jacket had been Rosa's favorite piece of clothing, something she had worn to school dances, first dates, and graduation from high school. After Rosa's death, their mother had given Kira the jacket as a way of keeping her sister's memory alive. Carmen had washed it carefully and stored it with sachets of lavender to preserve the scent, understanding that physical objects could provide comfort in ways that words never could. For Kira, wearing the jacket was like carrying a piece of her sister's strength and confidence with her, a tangible reminder that she came from people who were brave and resilient. "Just leave me alone," Kira said, turning back toward the window and attempting to end the interaction before it escalated further. She pulled her arms more tightly around herself, unconsciously protecting the jacket and what it represented. "Ooh, getting feisty now." Brittany's voice joined the chorus of harassment, her tone bright with the kind of malicious excitement that comes from sensing weakness and preparing to exploit it. "Maybe we should help her get a new one. This one looks like it's about to fall apart anyway." Before Kira could react or prepare herself, she felt hands grab the back of her jacket with rough, demanding force. Tyler had reached over the seat that separated them and was pulling at the fabric with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from knowing that no one would stop him. His grip was strong and insistent, and she could feel the delicate material beginning to strain under the pressure. "Come on, take it off," Tyler demanded, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone as he sensed resistance. "We're doing you a favor here. That thing is embarrassing." "Stop it," Kira protested, trying to hold onto the jacket while simultaneously attempting to twist away from Tyler's grip. But Tyler was much stronger than her, and he had the advantage of position and surprise. She could feel other passengers on the bus turning to watch the spectacle, some with obvious amusement, and others with the uncomfortable fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his characteristic cackle adding a soundtrack to the assault. "Afraid we'll see how pathetic you really are underneath." He reached forward and grabbed at one of the jacket's sleeves, adding his strength to Tyler's assault on the garment. The sound that followed was one that Kira would remember for the rest of her life, the distinct, heart-breaking sound of fabric tearing. She felt the jacket give way under the combined force of Tyler and Jake's pulling, heard the rip as threads that had held the garment together for years finally succumbed to more pressure than they were designed to withstand. As she clutched the torn remnants of her sister's jacket, Kira felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. The gentle, peace-loving philosophy that her mother had tried to instill in her, the patient endurance that had allowed her to survive months of harassment, the careful self-control that had kept her martial arts training locked away, all of it cracked and began to crumble like a dam that had finally reached its breaking point. "You had no right," she said, her voice trembling with a rage that was so pure and intense that it seemed to change the very atmosphere on the bus. When she turned around in her seat to face her tormentors, her brown eyes were blazing with a fury that none of them had ever seen before. "Oh, is the little baby going to cry?" Brittany taunted, holding up her phone with the camera app already activated. "This is going to be perfect for social media. Everyone needs to see this." The sight of Brittany's phone, the knowledge that this moment of devastating personal loss was being recorded for the entertainment of strangers, added another layer of violation to an already traumatic experience. Kira could already imagine the video being shared across social media platforms, accompanied by cruel captions and laughing emojis, turning her grief into content for other people's amusement. Mr. Patterson glanced in his rear-view mirror at the commotion, but his eyes quickly returned to the road ahead. Like most of the faculty at Jefferson High School, he had learned to turn a blind eye to Tyler's behavior. The Morrison family's generous donations to the school's athletic programs had bought their son a level of immunity that extended far beyond the wrestling mat, and challenging Tyler often meant facing pressure from administrators who preferred not to antagonize influential families. Kira stared at the destroyed jacket in her hands, feeling tears threaten to spill over as she processed the magnitude of what had just been taken from her. This wasn't just about a piece of clothing. It was about the deliberate destruction of one of her most precious connections to her deceased sister, a callous act of violence against her family's memory and her own emotional well-being. But beneath the sadness and sense of loss, something else was building inside her chest like a gathering storm. 8 years of martial arts training had taught her more than just fighting techniques. It had instilled in her a deep understanding of discipline, patience, and the ability to channel anger into focused, controlled action. Her Uncle Roberto's words echoed in her mind with sudden clarity. "A true warrior knows when to fight and when to walk away, but never let anyone take away your dignity." As the bus pulled into the school parking lot and students began gathering their belongings, Kira stood up slowly and deliberately. The torn jacket fell to the floor of the bus, and she stepped over it without looking back, her movements controlled and purposeful. Tyler and his friends were still laughing behind her, completely unaware that they had just crossed a line that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their relationship. The video that Brittany had recorded found its way onto social media within hours, spreading through the Jefferson High School student body like wildfire. The footage showed Kira's moment of vulnerability and defeat, but it also captured something else that most viewers missed on first viewing, a subtle change in her posture and expression that suggested the quiet girl they thought they knew was about to reveal a very different side of herself. The next few days passed in a blur of whispered conversations, pointing fingers, and uncomfortable stares that followed Kira through every hallway and classroom. Students who had previously ignored her existence now looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to cruelly entertained. The video had transformed her from an invisible target into a visible symbol of victimization, and the attention was overwhelming in its intensity. Even teachers seemed to look at her differently now, their expressions tinged with the kind of uncomfortable sympathy that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation secondhand. Some made awkward attempts to be extra kind to her, offering help with assignments or asking if she was okay in ways that only served to remind her of her public embarrassment. Others seemed to avoid eye contact altogether, as if her victimization was somehow contagious, and they might become targets themselves simply by acknowledging her existence. But something fundamental had changed in Kira during those days of public scrutiny and private reflection. Her posture had begun to straighten, her shoulders pulling back in a way that suggested growing confidence rather than defensive hunching. There was a new alertness in her eyes, a watchfulness that spoke of someone who was no longer content to simply endure whatever cruelty others chose to inflict upon her. She started arriving at school earlier, using the extra time to study her environment with the analytical mind of a fighter, assessing potential opponents and planning strategies. She took different routes through the hallways, timing her movements to avoid predictable patterns that could be exploited by those who wished her harm. She began to notice things she had missed before. The way Tyler favored his right hand when he gestured aggressively, Jake's poor balance when he laughed too hard, Brittany's instinctive step backward whenever someone showed genuine resistance to her psychological warfare. These observations were made with the systematic approach that her uncle Roberto had taught her during their training sessions. He had emphasized the importance of studying opponents before engaging them, learning their habits and weaknesses, identifying the moments when they were most vulnerable. Knowledge is the greatest weapon, he had told her repeatedly. Understand your enemy better than they understand themselves, and you will always have the advantage. Marcus had been the first person to notice the subtle but significant changes in Kira's demeanor and behavior. During one of their regular meetings in the library, he looked up from his calculus homework and studied her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people's emotional states for his own protection. "There's something different about you," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to other tables in the library. "You seem, I don't know, more confident, more focused." Kira looked up from her chemistry textbook and managed a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe I'm just tired of being pushed around," she replied, her words carrying an undertone of steel that hadn't been there before. "I know the feeling," Marcus replied, unconsciously touching the spot on his arm where his most recent bruise was hidden beneath his sleeve. "But Tyler's not someone you want to mess with directly. He sent Danny Rodriguez to the hospital last year during a wrestling match. The school called it an accident, but everyone knew better." The story of Danny Rodriguez had become part of Jefferson High School folklore, whispered in hallways and locker rooms as a cautionary tale about what happened to students who challenged Tyler's authority. Danny had been a sophomore who had made the mistake of standing up to Tyler during a cafeteria incident, and the resulting wrestling match had been so violent that it had required intervention from multiple teachers and a visit from paramedics. "What about you?" Kira asked, leaning forward slightly and studying Marcus's face with genuine concern. "Are you tired of being his punching bag?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered the question. "Every day," he admitted finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and frustration. "But what can I do? I'm not exactly built for fighting, and my parents would kill me if I got suspended for violence." "Neither am I," Kira said, and they both knew it was true from a physical perspective. But as she watched Tyler dominate another student in the hallway, visible through the library's glass doors, she felt her resolve hardening like metal being forged in fire. Her uncle Roberto had always told her that martial arts wasn't about size or natural strength. It was about technique, timing, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment was right. That evening, Kira stood in her small bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror attached to her second-hand dresser. The room itself told the story of their family's financial struggles. Furniture that had been purchased at thrift stores or inherited from relatives, walls that needed painting but couldn't be repaired due to their rental agreement, and carpet that was worn thin in patches from years of previous tenants. But none of that mattered as Kira began moving through the martial arts forms that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Her body remembered every lesson, every drill, every sparring session from her uncle's gym. The techniques flowed through her muscles like water, finding its course, each movement precise and controlled, despite months of inactivity. She thought about calling Uncle Roberto, knowing that he would want to hear from her and that he might offer advice about how to handle her current situation. But she also knew what he would say, that she had to find her own path forward, that he had taught her to defend herself, but the choice about when and how to use those skills was ultimately hers alone. The breaking point came exactly 1 week later, on a rainy Thursday morning in the school courtyard. Kira had been walking to her first class, her new daily route taking her through the covered walkway that connected the main building to the science wing, when she heard the sounds of a confrontation near the vending machines. The courtyard was normally a peaceful space, with concrete benches arranged around small planters that the environmental club maintained with flowers that changed with the seasons. Today, the rain was creating small puddles on the concrete, and the air was thick with humidity that made everything feel heavy and oppressive. As Kira rounded the corner, she saw Tyler and Jake cornering Marcus near the row of vending machines that dispensed snacks and drinks to students during break periods. Marcus was pressed against the brick wall, his face pale with fear, and his books clutched protectively against his chest. The smaller boy looked even more vulnerable than usual, soaked from the rain and clearly terrified by the aggressive postures of his tormentors. "I heard you've been talking to that loser girlfriend of yours," Tyler was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the empty courtyard despite the sound of rain falling on the concrete. "Telling her our business, sharing information that's none of her concern." "I didn't tell her anything," Marcus protested, but his voice shook with fear and the obvious lie. Kira realized that Tyler was referring to her and that Marcus was being punished for their growing friendship. "You calling me a liar?" Tyler grabbed Marcus by the front of his shirt and lifted him slightly off the ground, demonstrating his physical superiority in a way that was designed to humiliate as much as intimidate. "Maybe you need a reminder about who runs this school, about what happens to people who don't know their place." Kira felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as she watched the scene unfold. She had witnessed this type of interaction countless times over the past months, but seeing Marcus, kind, gentle Marcus, who had shown her friendship when no one else would, being terrorized by these bullies, triggered something primal and protective in her consciousness. The sight of her only friend being victimized because of his association with her was more than she could bear. All the months of careful self-control, all the patient endurance of her own harassment, all the disciplined restraint that had kept her martial arts training locked away. It all crumbled in an instant like a house of cards hit by a strong wind. "Let him go," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of rain on concrete with a clarity and authority that surprised even her. Tyler turned toward her, his expression shifting from cruel concentration to surprised amusement as he registered her presence. "Well, well, look who finally grew a spine," he said, his grip on Marcus loosening slightly but not releasing entirely. "What are you going to do about it, scholarship girl?" The nickname that had once made her cringe now sounded weak and pathetic coming from Tyler's mouth. Kira could see him more clearly now, not as an invincible force of nature, but as a bully who derived his power from the fear and submission of others. Without that fear, he was just another teenage boy with poor impulse control and a desperate need for validation. "I'm asking you nicely to let him go." Kira repeated, taking a deliberate step closer to the confrontation. She could feel her heart racing with adrenaline, but her breathing remained steady and controlled, just as Uncle Roberto had taught her during countless training sessions. Jake laughed nervously, clearly sensing that something about this interaction was different from their usual encounters with Kira. "Tyler, just ignore her," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "She's not worth the trouble." But Tyler's eyes had narrowed with the calculating cruelty that Kira had come to recognize as his most dangerous expression. He had been humiliating her for months without any meaningful resistance, and now she was challenging him in public where other students might witness his response. His reputation as the undisputed king of Jefferson High School demanded a decisive demonstration of power. "You want to be a hero?" Tyler shoved Marcus aside with casual brutality, sending the smaller boy stumbling against the vending machine. "Fine, let's see how heroic you feel when you're eating lunch through a straw for the next month." He swung at her with his right hand, exactly as Kira had observed him do countless times in previous confrontations with other students. The punch was powerful and fast, thrown with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious resistance from his victims. But this time, Kira was ready. She slipped to the side with fluid grace, letting Tyler's punch sail harmlessly past her ear while simultaneously driving her elbow into his ribs with surgical precision. The strike was perfectly targeted, hitting a nerve cluster that Uncle Roberto had taught her would cause maximum discomfort with minimal actual damage. Tyler gasped and stumbled backward, more surprised than seriously hurt, but clearly shaken by the unexpected reversal. "Lucky shot," he growled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in the confident facade that had defined his interactions with other students. Jake rushed forward to help his friend, motivated more by loyalty than courage and clearly unprepared for any kind of real confrontation. But Kira was already moving with the fluid efficiency of someone whose body had been trained to react instinctively to threats. She grabbed Jake's outstretched arm and used his own momentum against him, executing a perfect hip throw that sent him sprawling onto the wet concrete with a splash that echoed through the courtyard. The techniques flowed through her like water finding its natural course. 8 years of intensive training crystallizing into movements that were both beautiful and devastatingly effective. Every drill, every sparring session, every lesson about balance and leverage and timing, it all came together in a perfect demonstration of what Uncle Roberto had tried to teach her about the difference between violence and martial arts. Tyler came at her again, this time more cautiously and with greater respect for her capabilities. He was bigger and stronger than Kira, and under normal circumstances, those advantages might have been decisive. But Kira had speed and skill on her side, along with the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of disciplined training and months of suppressed anger finally finding its outlet. She ducked under his wild swing with practiced ease and swept his legs with a technique that was as much about timing as it was about force. Tyler went down hard, his larger frame hitting the concrete with an impact that seemed to echo through the courtyard. As he struggled to get back to his feet, clearly dazed and disoriented, Kira positioned herself between him and Marcus in a protective stance that made her intentions unmistakably clear. "Stay down," she warned, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins like electricity. The command was delivered with an authority that seemed to come from some deep well of confidence that had been hidden beneath months of careful self-restraint. "You think you're tough now?" Tyler spat, blood trickling from his lip where he had bitten it during his fall. "You have no idea what you just started. This isn't over." But as he looked up at her from his position on the wet concrete, Kira saw something she had never seen before in Tyler Morrison's eyes. Genuine fear. For the first time in his life, Tyler had encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his size, his reputation, or his family's influence. and the realization that he wasn't invincible was written clearly across his face for everyone to see. A crowd had begun to gather in the courtyard, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of Tyler Morrison being decisively defeated by someone half his size. Students pressed against the windows of surrounding classrooms, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, excitement, and disbelief. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, capturing video footage that would spread through the school's social networks faster than any official news. Brittany stood at the edge of the growing crowd, her phone forgotten in her hand, as she stared at her defeated friends with an expression of complete bewilderment. The carefully constructed social hierarchy that had defined her existence at Jefferson High School was crumbling before her eyes, and she seemed unable to process what she was witnessing. "This isn't over," Tyler repeated as he finally managed to get to his feet, Jake limping beside him like a wounded animal. But the threat sounded hollow and desperate rather than menacing. "Yes, it is," Kira replied with calm certainty. "Unless you want everyone to see you lose to a scholarship girl again." Tyler's face flushed red with humiliation and rage, but he didn't respond with words or actions. Instead, he turned and walked away with as much dignity as he could muster, Jake trailing behind him and casting nervous glances over his shoulder as if expecting another attack. The crowd began to disperse, but Kira could hear the excited, whispered conversations and see the new way students were looking at her, with respect rather than pity, with admiration rather than contempt. "Are you okay?" she asked Marcus, who was still leaning against the vending machine with an expression of amazement. "I should be asking you that," he said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. "Where did you learn to fight like that? That was incredible." "My uncle taught me," Kira said simply, as if the devastatingly effective martial arts display they had just witnessed was the most natural thing in the world. "I used to train at his gym back in Phoenix." Marcus stared at her with new respect and understanding. "Why didn't you ever fight back before? You could have ended all of this months ago." Kira considered the question carefully, thinking about all the factors that had contributed to her long period of restraint. "Because I hoped I wouldn't have to," she said finally, "but seeing them hurt you because of me." She trailed off, not sure how to explain the protective instinct that had finally overridden her peaceful nature and her mother's teachings about avoiding violence. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made Kira's heart skip a beat. "No one's ever stood up for me like that. No one's ever been willing to fight for me." As they walked to class together, Kira felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following them down the hallway. Word of the fight had spread with the supernatural speed that characterized high school gossip networks, and she knew that her days of invisibility were permanently over. But for the first time since arriving at Jefferson High School, she didn't feel the need to hide or make herself small. She had found her voice, and more importantly, she had found the courage to use it. The next few weeks brought a dramatic and comprehensive shift in the social dynamics of Jefferson High School that affected far more than just the primary participants in the Courtyard confrontation. Tyler's crew, which had once been the undisputed rulers of the school's social hierarchy, seemed diminished and uncertain, like deposed monarchs trying to figure out how to navigate a world where their authority was no longer absolute. Jake walked with a noticeable limp for several days after his encounter with the concrete, and his characteristic nervous laughter had been replaced by a watchful silence that suggested he was constantly evaluating potential threats. He avoided eye contact with other students and seemed to stick close to walls and exits, as if planning escape routes in case he found himself in another confrontation he couldn't win. Brittany tried desperately to maintain her queen bee status through increasingly shrill attempts at social manipulation, but her comments lacked their usual venom and confidence. The video of Tyler's defeat had gone viral within the school community, and her association with the losing side had damaged her carefully cultivated image of invincibility. Other students who had once sought her approval now seemed to view her with skepticism and mild contempt. Tyler himself seemed to physically shrink whenever he encountered Kira in the hallways, his once commanding presence reduced to furtive glances and hurried detours that took him away from any potential confrontation. The confident swagger that had defined his movement through the school had been replaced by a defensive posture that suggested he was constantly aware of his own vulnerability. Other students began approaching Kira with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and barely concealed excitement. Some wanted to hear her first-hand account of the fight, eager for details that hadn't been captured in the various cell phone videos that continued to circulate through social media. Others simply wanted to be associated with someone who had accomplished what many of them had only dreamed of, standing up to the school's most notorious bully and winning decisively. The lunch invitations came from multiple social groups who had previously ignored her existence entirely. Popular students who had never acknowledged her presence suddenly wanted her to sit at their tables, seemingly hoping that some of her newfound legendary status would rub off on them through proximity. But Kira found that she preferred the quiet company of Marcus and the small group of thoughtful, intelligent students who valued substance over spectacle and genuine friendship over social networking. "You know you're like a legend now, right?" Marcus said one afternoon as they walked to their lockers after another peaceful lunch in the library. "I heard someone started a rumor that you're actually an undercover MMA fighter who was sent here by some secret government program." Kira laughed, and the sound was lighter and more genuine than it had been in months. The constant tension that had defined her existence at Jefferson High had finally begun to ease, replaced by a sense of confidence and security that felt almost foreign after so many months of anxiety and fear. "That's ridiculous," she said. "I'm just someone who got tired of being pushed around." "Well, whatever you are, I'm glad you're here," Marcus replied, and the sincerity in his voice carried an emotional weight that made Kira's heart skip a beat and her cheeks flush slightly. Their friendship had deepened significantly since the confrontation in the courtyard, evolving from mutual support, born of shared victimization, into something more genuine and meaningful. They spent increasing amounts of time together, sharing conversations about their hopes and dreams for the future that went far beyond the immediate concerns of high school social dynamics. Marcus had revealed his passionate ambition to study computer science at MIT, and his enthusiasm for technology and programming was infectious and inspiring. He talked about developing software that could help solve real-world problems, about using artificial intelligence to improve medical diagnosis, about creating systems that could make education more accessible to underserved communities. His vision of the future was both practical and idealistic, grounded in technical knowledge, but motivated by a genuine desire to make the world better. In return, Kira shared her own dreams of becoming a veterinarian, inspired by her childhood experiences helping injured animals in her neighborhood and her deep belief that all living creatures deserved compassion and care. She talked about opening a practice that would serve low-income families who couldn't afford expensive veterinary care, about working with animal rescue organizations, about maybe even traveling to developing countries to help with wildlife conservation efforts. These conversations revealed depths to both of their characters that had been hidden beneath the defensive facades they had constructed to survive high school. Marcus proved to be thoughtful and idealistic, with a gentle sense of humor and an impressive knowledge of music, literature, and science that made every conversation intellectually stimulating. Kira discovered that she enjoyed sharing her thoughts and dreams with someone who listened without judgment and responded with genuine interest and encouragement. The real test of the new social order came 3 weeks after the Courtyard incident, during what would prove to be the final confrontation between Kira and Tyler's diminished regime. The setting was the cafeteria during the busiest part of lunch period, when the large dining hall was packed with students engaged in the complex social negotiations that determined who sat where and with whom. Kira was walking through the crowded room, navigating between the circular tables and bench seating, when she heard a commotion near the serving line that made her stop and pay attention. A group of students had gathered around something that was happening near the food service area, their voices excited and cruel in a way that she immediately recognized as the sound of pack behavior targeting a vulnerable individual. As she pushed through the crowd, using her small size to slip between larger students who were craning their necks to see the action, she discovered Tyler holding a smaller student upside down over one of the large trash cans that were positioned throughout the cafeteria. The victim was a freshman who looked even younger than his actual age, clearly terrified and completely helpless in Tyler's powerful grip. "Come on, Tyler!" Someone in the crowd called out with obvious enthusiasm. "Do it! Dump him!" But Tyler hesitated when he spotted Kira watching from the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met across the packed cafeteria, and she could see the internal struggle playing out on his face in real time. Part of him desperately wanted to reassert his dominance, to prove that one fight hadn't fundamentally changed the power dynamics at Jefferson High School. But another part of him clearly remembered the humiliation of being defeated by someone half his size, and the fear of experiencing that humiliation again was written clearly in his expression. "Put him down," Kira said, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite the background noise of hundreds of conversations and the clatter of lunch trays. The cafeteria fell silent with supernatural speed, as if someone had thrown a switch that instantly muted every conversation in the room. Students turned to look between Kira and Tyler, sensing the tension that crackled between them, like electricity, and recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would define the social hierarchy for the rest of the school year. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for since the Courtyard incident. The inevitable rematch that would determine whether Tyler's defeat had been a fluke or the beginning of a new era at Jefferson High School. The silence was so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed loud, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tyler's grip on the freshman loosened slightly, but he didn't immediately release his victim. "Or what?" he challenged, but his voice lacked the confidence and authority that had once made him so intimidating. "Or I'll make you put him down," Kira replied with calm certainty that seemed to come from some deep well of confidence that had been forged in the crucible of her recent victory. For a long moment that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other across the crowded cafeteria. The freshman hung suspended in Tyler's weakening grip, too terrified to struggle or speak. The assembled crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see whether Tyler would risk another public humiliation or finally acknowledge that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Then, slowly and with obvious reluctance, Tyler lowered the freshman to the ground. The boy scrambled away immediately, leaving Tyler standing alone in the center of the circle of students, his defeat complete and public and witnessed by virtually the entire school population. "This is pathetic," Brittany said, her voice cutting through the silence with a shrillness that betrayed her own desperation and fear. "You're actually afraid of her now?" Tyler's face darkened with humiliation and rage, but he didn't respond to either Kira's challenge or Brittany's taunt. Instead, he turned and walked out of the cafeteria with as much dignity as he could muster, leaving his former followers to face the whispers and stares of their peers without the protection of his intimidating presence. As the crowd began to disperse, a normal cafeteria noise gradually resumed. Kira felt Marcus's hand on her shoulder. She turned to find him smiling at her with obvious admiration and something that might have been affection. "You didn't even have to fight," he said with wonder in his voice. "You just won." "Sometimes the threat of force is more powerful than force itself," Kira replied. remembering another of Uncle Roberto's lessons about the psychology of conflict and the importance of understanding that true victory often came without physical confrontation. That afternoon, as Kira walked to her final class of the day, she found Tyler waiting by her locker in a scene that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. He looked different, without his usual crowd of followers, smaller somehow, more human, stripped of the intimidating aura that had made him seem larger than life. His cocky smirk had been replaced by something that might have been shame, and his posture suggested vulnerability rather than aggression. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice lacking the aggressive tone that had characterized all of their previous interactions. Kira studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden anger. But what she saw instead was genuine uncertainty and what appeared to be a desire to make amends. About what? About what happened? About everything. Tyler ran a hand through his bleached hair in a gesture that seemed nervous rather than calculated. "I never thought anyone would stand up to me like that, especially not someone like you." "Someone like me?" Kira's voice carried a warning that suggested she was prepared for this conversation to turn confrontational if necessary. "I didn't mean it like that," Tyler said quickly, clearly recognizing the danger in his words. "I meant someone who seemed quiet, peaceful, not like the kind of person who could kick my ass so thoroughly." Despite herself, Kira almost smiled at his blunt honesty. "Is that supposed to be an apology?" Tyler looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like someone who was navigating unfamiliar territory. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "I've never had to apologize to anyone before, and I don't really know how to do it right." He paused, seeming to gather his courage for what came next. "But I'm sorry. For the jacket, for all the harassment, for making your life miserable. I was just angry all the time, and taking it out on people who couldn't fight back seemed easier than dealing with my own problems." "What problems?" Kira asked, genuinely curious about what could drive someone to be so consistently cruel to others. "My dad," Tyler said simply, and suddenly his entire persona made more sense. "He's been on my case about wrestling, about grades, about everything I do. Nothing is ever good enough for him, and I guess I thought if I could control something, control someone, it would make me feel better about being controlled at home." Kira felt a flicker of understanding and even sympathy. Through her martial arts training, Uncle Roberto had taught her about the cycle of abuse and how people who felt powerless in their own lives often sought to exert power over others who were more vulnerable. It didn't excuse Tyler's behavior, but it helped explain the psychological mechanisms that had driven his cruelty. "That doesn't make what you did okay," she said firmly. "I know," Tyler replied without hesitation, "but I want to try to make it right, starting with this." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper with the careful attention of someone who had put thought and effort into the presentation. "I can't fix your sister's jacket, and I know nothing can replace something that meant so much to you, but I thought maybe this could be a start." Kira unwrapped the package carefully to find a new denim jacket that was similar in style to the one that had been destroyed, but clearly expensive and high quality. The tags were still attached, showing that it had come from one of the upscale boutiques in the mall, the kind of store that Kira had never been able to afford to shop in. "Tyler, I can't accept this," she said, though she was genuinely touched by the gesture and the obvious thought that had gone into selecting something that honored the memory of what had been lost. "Please," he said, and there was genuine pleading in his voice. "It's not about the money, it's about trying to do something right for once in my life." Kira looked at the jacket, then at Tyler's face, seeing the genuine remorse and desire for redemption that was written in his expression. Uncle Roberto had always taught her that true strength lay not just in the ability to defeat an enemy, but in the wisdom to know when to extend mercy and the grace to forgive those who showed genuine repentance. "Thank you," she said finally. "This means a lot, and I can see that you put real thought into it." Tyler nodded, relief visible in his posture, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I also wanted you to know that I'm going to talk to Coach Martinez about starting an anti-bullying program at the school. Maybe if other kids learn better ways to deal with their problems and anger, they won't have to go through what I put you through." "That's a really good idea," Kira said, impressed by the thoughtfulness of his proposal. "And Tyler? Everyone deserves a chance to change and become better than they were." As Tyler walked away, Kira felt a profound sense of completion and closure. She had stood up for herself and protected others who couldn't protect themselves, but she had also demonstrated mercy and forgiveness when victory was assured. The jacket incident had been about more than just defending herself. It had been about proving that strength and compassion could coexist, that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Marcus appeared at her side as she watched Tyler disappear down the hallway, probably heading to find Coach Martinez and begin the process of turning his newfound understanding into positive action. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked softly. "How does what feel?" "Winning. Really, truly winning." Kira considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that had changed since that morning on the bus when her sister's jacket had been destroyed. "It feels like I finally found my voice," she said, "and learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to show them who you really are underneath all the fear and doubt." As they walked out of Jefferson High School together, Kira felt the weight of the new jacket on her shoulders. It wasn't her sister's jacket, and it never would be. Nothing could replace that connection to Rose's memory. But it represented something equally important: the power to stand up for herself and others, the courage to face her fears head-on, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to forgive. The hallways that had once seemed so threatening and hostile now felt like just another part of her journey toward becoming the person she was meant to be. She was no longer the scared, invisible girl who had first walked through these doors months ago, trying desperately to avoid attention and conflict. She was Kira Valdez, someone who had found her strength not in violence, but in the courage to be herself and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The story of the quiet girl who had stood up to Jefferson High School's most notorious bully would become the stuff of legend, passed down through graduating classes and shared in whispered conversations in hallways and locker rooms. But for Kira, it was just the beginning of understanding who she truly was and who she could become when she stopped hiding her light under a bushel and started letting it shine for all the world to see.